Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 28th chapter of the first book of Chronicles. The antecedent narrative context really begins in the 22nd chapter. Therein we read David give words of advice to a son, Solomon, the contents of which suggests that he intended him to be his successor. Then he makes it public in the first two verses of the 23rd chapter, but he mentions the fact, as he does in the first verse of the chapter we're going to cover today, that everyone who was anyone was there. And then so from the 23rd to the 27th chapter, it's really a list of names that don't mean a whole lot to us, but they did to their original audience. The Jews were an intensely genealogical people, so even though it is somewhat boring for us to read the list of the names, he is writing to them. But the second half of the 27th chapter really begins in the 21st chapter. That's when we start our review, we have to establish that narrative context as well, and that begins in the 21st chapter. That's when David does Satan's bidding without even knowing it. He conducts a census on his own initiative of all the able-bodied men that he would have at his disposal in the event of a war. And Joab, his chief general, protests the wisdom of this course of action. He correctly anticipates that Israel will bear the brunt of his guilt, but he does it anyway because his word is powerless to prevail over his kings. And then, the wrath comes. He gives him three options, each of which are rooted in covenantal curses. The gentlest one was he had the angel of death. David can't even decide when he is given the option by the voice of God himself, but God ultimately settles on and selects on having the angel of death slay 70,000 men in Israel in a 3-day period. The other consequences would have been 3 years of being militarily on the run and at the mercy of their enemies, or have a famine for 3 years. So he did choose the most painful one, and David is repentant, and he has the heart of a shepherd for his sheep. And this sin was part of the providential purpose, arranging for the property of the temple. Now, the temple, he had in the 17th chapter, he had been told that he would not be the one to build the temple, but his son would. So he would not live to see the promise, but he had the promise nevertheless. And he was also given a more exalted promise, the dynasty in perpetuity, but we don't want to get distracted by that. 23rd verse, 27th chapter review. But David did not take the number of those 20 years old and under, because Yahweh had said he would increase Israel like the stars of the heaven. This was once a promise grasped in faith. This was something that was invisible. Abraham had only the hope of the promise that one day his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the heavens and the sand on the seashore. So whether he looked above him or below him, he would have a reminder of this fantastic promise. And they were living proof. By the time of David, they were a force to be reckoned with, this nation among nations that, through David's military prowess, they were subdued and secure. But, put to the point, he didn't want to go too far in the census, so he had the promise, and the author of Chronicles is reminding the reader of the promise. So ultimately, David points to a messianic figure to come, as does Solomon in the chronicler's emphasis. He emphasizes his military role, but also his priestly role. He is credited with the design of the temple itself in the range we're going to read. Joab, son of Zeruiah, began a census, but he did not finish, for wrath came upon Israel because of his census, nor was the number recorded in the account of the annals of King David. Now, the reason why is indicated in the 21st chapter. By the time he got to the Levites, there was just, no sense in registering able-bodied men on the Levites. These were men who could not fight. They were the priests. In Benjamin, they were just so fed up. Now, the commoners would have resented censuses because they knew it was a pretext for a foreign war, being conscripted for forced labor or foreign wars or heavy taxations. But before he could even finish, according to this passage, the angel of death did what he did. And but there is the number, the ultimate sum equation of the census was not. David ultimately was frustrated and failed, even though he had this meticulous organizational sense. He was not able to record in his private annals, his public ones, whatever they were, the number that had been gathered by this. So, by the time the plague came, David got the message not to persist. Verses 25 pretty much all the way to the end are just the personnel, the royal personnel, the palace personnel that David would have relied on. He had a treasury, all kings did, storehouses in the field, work of the field, vineyards, wine cellars, olive trees and sycamore trees, oil stores, herds, camels, donkeys, and these would have been his private possessions. But in the 31st verse we read, all these were heads over the property of King David. So as a king, he would have had a palace and a property, the maintenance of which was an expense in itself. But part of Solomon's ingenuity was he was able to feed not only one palace, but also King Hiram's palace. That was part of the provisions in the trade agreement arranged between them for what he would do. So that was a real testament of his ingenuity. And Jonathan, David's uncle, was a counselor of a wise man and a scribe. 32nd verse. We also read of another relative of David in the 18th verse, Elihu, presumably the eldest brother, even though he is referenced as Eliam in the first Samuel 16th chapter. He was the eldest of Jesse's born, and here David, who was the 8th born, the youngest one, but the man after God's own heart, and who the prophet's anointing clearly came. So that in David's selection as the 8th born, we have a reminder that God often uses the unlikeliest of characters to accomplish his wise providential designs. But this uncle of his was might have been a brother of Jesse's. It may have been an uncle by marriage, but in any case, he was a fountain of wisdom, and he was extremely wise. And, the king also had another counselor and a king's companion. Kings customarily would have traveled with one public friend. Elizabeth had one by the name of Bess, Queen Elizabeth I of England. And, of course, the chief of the sovereign's army was Joab in verse 34. Joab was his general, the one that David had come to rely on in lieu of in the 16th chapter when it was time for the king, springtime, when kings customarily went to war. But the chronicler is absent on the mention of his indulgence with Bathsheba, his great sin, but through that illicit union, the son and successor would be born, the one who would build the temple. And that takes us to the 28th chapter, first verse lesson itself. And David assembled at Jerusalem all the rulers of Israel, the rulers of the tribes of the commanders of the divisions who served in the king, the commanders over thousands and the commanders over hundreds, and the heads over all the property and possessions of the kings and of his sons, with the officials, the mighty men, and all the mighty brave men. All these litany list is who's who in the kingdom. This would have been a very public occasion, during which time the king would have summoned everyone who was anyone. The rulers of the tribe, these are mentioned. There are 12 tribes in Israel. In Judah's chief ruler was David's eldest brother. But there were 11 others, and then there's all these, anyone who is anyone in the military, whether a commander of thousands or even a commander of 100. The Roman equivalent would have been the centurion for that effect. So everyone who is anyone in the army, in the priesthood, in the pecking order, in the food chain of Israel would have been there. And just all the property and possessions, we read the individuals who were custodians, trusted stewards for all the vast properties and possessions of David. They would have been there too. And the mighty men, all the mighty brave men. David was a mighty man, a slayer of giants. But in the 16th chapter, we read that he was not the only giant slayer in Israel. But David's claim to distinction was that he did so when he was 14 years old. Then King David rose to his feet and said, "Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of Yahweh and for the footstool of our Elohim, and had made preparations to build it. He's standing on his feet, so he's publicly speaking, and what he says is just pay attention, listen closely. What I have to say is something significant, my brothers and my people. But his deepest desire, now David being a man after God's own heart, his deepest desire was to build the house, because he was looking at his palace in the 17th chapter, his magnificently adorned palace of cedar and the Ark of Covenant. It pricked his conscience that the Ark of the Covenant was not resting in a house at least as magnificent as his. And the Ark of the Covenant had a restless experience prior to David's bringing it to Jerusalem, where it would remain in Solomon's temple. But he brought it to rest. So, and he also calls it the footstool of Elohim. This is because the earth is dirty. So where does the earth is the dirtiest place in his universe. It is defiled and corrupted as no other planet quite is. But, David did all that he could do to build it without defying the commandment of building it. So he had been forbidden, but he had been provided with a promise, a dynasty in perpetuity. And also that his son would be the one. He would supply him a son. He had the invisible hope of the temple, but he could not see it. And he does refer to it, interestingly enough, in some of the Psalms. Before there was even a temple, he spoke of temples. But Elohim said to me, "You do not build a house for my name, because you have been a man of battle and have shed blood." So the voice of God, David had a prophet. This was his communicative conduit between him and divinity. But, Yahweh also spoke to David, not just his prophet. He was personally visited by the voice of God, and Solomon, his son, was personally visited by the presence of God on 2 occasions. But he told them that your intentions are good, but for reasons beyond your immediate understanding, you are not the one to build the temple. There is a reason in the season. So his son Solomon writes in the 3rd chapter, a time to build and a time to destroy, depending on the translation. But for David was, now the Chronicles actually explains, he is not given an explanation in the 17th chapter, but the reason why is because he was a man of war. And there's nothing unethical about the God-sanctioned and God-blessed warfare that David waged, but the amount of blood that he had shed ceremonially defiled him in a sense. There was too much blood on his hands to build the temple. Yet Yahweh Elohim of Israel chose me above all the house of my fathers to be a king over Israel forever, for he has chosen Judah to be the ruler, and the house of Judah, the house of my father, and among the sons of my father. He was pleased with me to make me reign over all Israel. David was aware that it was through God's grace that he had risen from the sheep pen to the throne of Israel. And he was the 8th born, so the principle of primogeniture is that the eldest born inherits the throne. But David was the man after God's own heart, the one in whom the prophet instantly and thoroughly recognized that he was the one to be anointed. Once more, God uses the unlikeliest of characters, but David did not ascend to the throne the typical way. He was a founder of a dynasty. He was not born in royalty. He was not groomed as a prince, as was Solomon. He was a shepherd before he became a king, and it was through God's grace that he had raised him. But David's selection really begins in Jacob's prophecy to the tribe of Judah that we read of in the 49th chapter of Genesis. Genesis 49, 8 through 10. But in any case, he being a man after God's own heart, he was pleased, he was approved and selected, he was chosen to establish his rule as a blessing over Israel. So David's predecessor, Saul, was a curse, because in even electing to have a monarchy, that was an act of faithlessness. They were to be an exceptional nation, but God ultimately did bless their request with a king worthy of the throne, 2 of them in succession. in all of my sons, for Yahweh has given me many sons. He has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of Yahweh over Israel. Polygamy was the customary practice of ancient monarchs, and David was certainly no exception. He had numerous wives, one of which was the mother of Amnon, who was slain by Absalom, who was who was married to a daughter of kings, or her mother was the daughter of kings. And Solomon's mother, of course, was Bathsheba, his moment of weakness, his outstanding failure. But the chronicler is absent in the mention of that failure, but it was providentially arranged. Now, what kings would have done, the customary practice for a polygamous marriage was for the king to invest the throne in the eldest born son of their favorite wife. So when Solomon, now the chronicler is also absent in the mention of the power struggle that we read of in 1 Kings, when Adoniah, the younger brother of Absalom, who himself tried to usurp the throne from his father David, tried to usurp the throne from Solomon. But this paints a rosy picture of just a smooth transition. David is not ill and decrepit and just so lax in disciplining his son. There's no mention of that. So that it is a whitewashing of his failures. But in any case, by the time of Rehoboam, now Solomon's son was born to him before he married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, because he inherited the throne when he was 41 years old, and he ruled for a 40-year time. So, but he was the eldest born, and he inherited the throne. But when Rehoboam passed his throne on to his successors, he made it his favorite wife, who was related to Absalom in some way, might have been incestuous, in fact. The son by her marriage was the one and that became more or less the pattern of the polygamous marital arrangements of these ancient Near Eastern despots, and said to me, Solomon, your son is the one to build my house and my courtyard, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I myself am a father to him. So Solomon's selection was not by David, but it was ordained by God. Remember, David was spoken to by the voice of the Almighty, and here he tells him that Solomon is the son. He doesn't mention his name. He says a son in the 17th chapter. Now he's saying Solomon is the son. But he's going to be, by his selection, he has something in him. He was wiser, and of course Adoniah was the eldest born living son left of David by the time that David died. But he is going to have the same paternal affection in his son that flourished between the father. And I shall establish his kingdom forever, if he is strong to do my commandments and my just judgments, as it is this day. Now, the idea of the dynasty in perpetuity was, from the chronicler's standpoint, invalidated. So the reign, why is the chronicler including the promise then? It is to portend to the Messiah whom they had not yet seen. So this is a vital link to the New Testament. And in fact, the Chronicles are the last listed in the original Hebrew arrangement of the Old Testament. They're the final of the writings. But in David, in this whitewashed picture of David and Solomon, we have portends and omens of the king who was from eternity, the Messiah, who is 28 generations descended, at least, according to Matthew's genealogy in the first chapter. But he's and then after the chroniclers, the closest thing to a Messiah that the Jewish people has yet have is Judas Maccabees. Judas Maccabee, the one whose exploits we read in the intertestamental deuterocanonical books, though the author of them hardly writes with the confidence of an inspired one. But he did liberate, he did restore control of the Jewish nation to its people for a brief hiatus. Then it ultimately succumbed. It was ripe with divisions, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Herodians, and then they ultimately succumbed to Rome in the year 163. So his dynasty clearly did not last, yet the people who were reading this in the centuries after could finally read it and recognize that the promise had come when we living in a post-Christ era. And now before the eyes of all Israel, the assemblies of Yahweh, and the hearing of our Elohim, keep and seek all the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, so that you possess this good land, and leave it as an inheritance for your children after you forever. So he's telling him that the eyes of God are on him. The king, as much as the commoner in the Israel monarchy, was bound by the law of Moses. In fact, they were commanded to carry a portable copy with them at all times. So David is stressing the necessity and the imperative of obedience. And that is something we do. Be wise to do. So we have a model of a father's parting words to a son, and none of us are royalty. We're not going to be passing a kingdom, but we can impass wisdom, and we can, this faith of ours is never one generation away from extinction, so we have to instill it in them to carry the torch of the flame of this race we've been running for 2,000 years. But, through his diligence, he would leave a land that the people, the future generations of Israelites could be proud of if he did it right. So, he did leave an inheritance, but of course in the writings of Ecclesiastes, one of the vanities of life, as he defines it, is leaving an inheritance to a successor of questionable moral caliber, and Rehoboam was certainly nothing to boast about. But the forever, the eternal element is linked to the dynasty that he's to establish. And Solomon was not a biological ancestor of Yahshua, because on Mary's side, the only one, Joseph, was his stepfather, and he was descended from the line of Solomon, but his mother Mary was descended from Nathan, another son of David. As for you, my son Solomon, know the Elohim of your fathers, and serve him with a perfect heart and with a pleasing life, for Yahweh searches all hearts and understands all the intents of the thoughts. If you do seek him, he is found by you, but if you forsake him, he rejects you forever. First thing Elohim is described as is a father. He is a paternal investment and an affection and a relationship between us and him. He is our father in heaven, and we are also his servants. He is our master as well as our father, so we shouldn't get too comfortable and cozy in that relationship. We do remain, but the perfect heart, that just means the best of our abilities, perfection. It belongs to him, and it is idolatrous to even imagine that we could have anything close to an absolutely perfect heart. But perfect is also it's an absolute term in reference to him, but it's also a relative term in reference to us, because progress, not perfection, is the aim of the game. And if you are in the path of progress, then you are in the process of perfection, even though it will evade us and elude us because we are frail humans and it's beyond our capacity to have. But we still can lead pleasing lives if life itself is God's gift to us. How we live that life can be our gift to him. So we have to be accepted and approved, and we have to be proven and thrown through the ringer. But the subterranean insight of Yahweh, the all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky, is able to penetrate past the superficial exterior. He sees the heart and the mind, and he knows them perfectly, and he knows them totally. And that's ultimately what he judges. So all the intents of the thoughts. So discipline your mind. 19th century Jewish rabbi said the human mind is the holy of holies, and to admit an evil, unclean, or impure thought in there was tantamount to setting up an idol in the temple of God. But these are, he's right to stress the warning of all these ramifications. So if you forsake him, he's going to reject you forever. So, did Solomon, who came to forsake him towards the tail end of his life, is he rejected forever? Is he in hell? And that's something I don't know the answer to, but I'm personally partial to the possibility that he is in heaven for all the good that he did. We're actually going to close up here. We still have verses 10 through 21, but this took a little longer than anticipated, but we want to give each verse the full attention and concentration that it deserves. So we're going to wrap up here, and we'll continue this lesson sometime soon. Thank you so much. I'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.